The day we buried my mother-in-law, I came home to find my husband's family already dividing up her life. I remember standing in the doorway of her house, the house where she'd lived for 37 years, where she'd raised 3 kids, where she'd taught me how to make her cornbread from scratch the first Thanksgiving I spent with the family. And I could hear them talking before they even knew I was there. My husband's brother, his voice carrying the way it always did when he thought he was the smartest person in the room, my sister-in-law laughing at something. The low murmur of a conversation that stops the second they heard my footsteps on the porch. I was 31 years old. I had just watched my husband's mother, the woman who had welcomed me into her family more warmly than anyone, lowered into the ground, and I had just driven 40 minutes back from the cemetery alone because my husband Thomas had ridden with his siblings. He'd said it would be easier. I told myself that was fine. It was not fine. I should back up. My name is Adriana, and Thomas and I had been married for 4 years when his mother, Ruth, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She was 68. She was one of the strongest, most quietly capable people I have ever known in my life. A retired school principal from outside of Columbus, Ohio, who kept a garden, volunteered at her church, and never once raised her voice when she could make her point just as clearly without it. Thomas has 2 siblings. His older brother, whose name I'll just say starts with a D and who I'll call my brother-in-law throughout this story, and his younger sister, who I'll call my sister-in-law. I don't use their names not to protect them, honestly. I just don't want to give them the dignity of being characters in a story they tried to make sure I'd never get to tell. When Ruth got sick, Thomas and I made changes. I was working remotely as a UX designer at the time, so we decided I would go stay with her 3 days a week while Thomas drove down on weekends. His brother lived 40 minutes away and checked in occasionally. His sister lived in Phoenix and flew back twice in 8 months. I was the one who took Ruth to her chemo appointments. I was the one who learned how her pain medication schedule worked. I was the one who sat with her on the bad nights when she couldn't sleep, and we'd watch old episodes of The Golden Girls until 2 in the morning, and she'd squeeze my hand and say, "You know, Adriana, I used to hope Thomas would find someone kind. I didn't dare hope he'd find someone like you." I'm not saying this to make myself sound like a saint. I'm saying it because it matters to what came next. Ruth passed in February. The service was held on a Thursday. It was gray and cold the way Ohio in February always is, and there were more people at that funeral than I expected. Former students, neighbors going back 20 years, women from her church who came and organized carpools. She had lived a full life, and the people showed up to say so. After the burial, the family was meant to gather at Ruth's house. It had been arranged ahead of time. Her neighbor had organized food. Family friends were coming by. I drove separately because I needed a few minutes alone. I had cried through most of the service, and I needed the drive to collect myself. I pulled up and sat in the car for maybe 2 minutes. I could see lights on inside. I assumed people had already arrived. I went up to the porch and reached for the door handle, and that's when I heard it. My brother-in-law's voice, clear through the front window that was cracked maybe 2 inches. "She doesn't need to know about the investment accounts yet. Let the lawyer handle the house announcement and we go from there." I froze. My sister-in-law said something I couldn't fully make out, and then he said, louder, "Thomas will go along with it. You know how he is. He just needs to be guided." I stood there on that porch in my black coat with the funeral program still folded in my hand, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger yet. Something colder than anger. Something that felt like the floor dropping out from underneath the room you thought you knew. I opened the door. They were standing in Ruth's kitchen, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law, and a man I didn't recognize who later turned out to be my brother-in-law's college friend, someone he'd apparently been calling for advice. Thomas was not in the room. I found out later he was in the garage looking through some of his mother's things. The conversation stopped the moment I walked in. "Adriana." My brother-in-law smiled the way he always smiled at me, which was like someone who had practiced smiling in a mirror. "We were just talking about the arrangements for the estate." "I heard," I said. There was a pause. My sister-in-law looked at her phone. "It's been a long day," he said. "Why don't you go find Thomas?" I want to tell you I said something cutting and perfect in that moment. I didn't. I just nodded and walked to the garage, and I stood there with my husband while he held an old photograph of his mother and cried, and I put my arms around him and I didn't say anything yet. I need to explain something about Thomas before I go further, because this story isn't really about him doing something wrong, it's about him not doing enough of what was right. Thomas is a good man. He is genuinely, fundamentally a decent person who loves me and loved his mother. He is also someone who had spent his entire life being managed by his older brother, and he didn't always see it happening. His brother had always been the one who took charge, who decided things, who spoke for the family in the way that families sometimes let one person speak without ever voting on it. Thomas had learned to defer in small ways that had calcified over time into something much larger. It wasn't weakness exactly. It was a pattern so old he couldn't see it anymore. I saw it. The days following the funeral were what I can only describe as a slow unwinding of everything I thought I understood about the family I had married into. Ruth's estate was handled by an attorney she had appointed years before, a woman named Helen who had been her estate planner for over a decade. The will reading was scheduled for 10 days after the funeral. In the meantime, certain things started happening that I want to document clearly. 3 days after Ruth passed, my sister-in-law came to the house while I was there alone. Thomas was at work, and she asked if she could take some of Ruth's jewelry. She said Ruth had promised her the pearl earrings and the gold bracelet she always wore. I told her I wasn't comfortable with anyone taking anything from the estate before the will was read, and that she should ask Thomas. She smiled tightly and said she understood. The next morning, I noticed that a small jewelry box that had been on Ruth's dresser was no longer there. I took photos of the dresser. I wrote down the date and time. I don't entirely know why I did that instinctively. Something in me had already gone into a kind of alert state that I couldn't fully explain yet. The night before the will reading, I was lying awake at around midnight when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from an app I almost never checked, a notes app I had shared with Thomas years ago when we were coordinating on something and had never unshared. He had added a note. I don't think he meant for me to see it. It read, "Dee says if I sign the power of attorney thing before Thursday, it simplifies everything and Adriana doesn't need to be at the meeting." I read it 3 times. I set my phone face down on the nightstand and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about Ruth holding my hand at 2 in the morning. I thought about 40-minute drives to the cancer center. I thought about the pearl earrings on the empty dresser. And I thought about that phrase, Adriana doesn't need to be at the meeting. I didn't wake Thomas up. I got up, went to the kitchen, made tea, and I called my own mother. She picked up on the second ring because that is who my mother is. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is a skill I have never mastered but have always admired in her. When I finished, she was quiet for a second and then she said, "Honey, you need to call a lawyer first thing in the morning." I called an estate attorney in Columbus the next morning at 8:32 a.m. I explained the situation. She told me several important things that I want to share because I genuinely think they matter. First, as Thomas's spouse, depending on Ohio state law and the specific terms of the estate, I may have had rights in standing that his siblings were trying to obscure. Second, a power of attorney signed under certain circumstances, particularly if Thomas didn't fully understand what he was signing, could potentially be challenged. Third, the removal of property from an estate before the will is read can constitute a legal problem. She told me to document everything and come in that afternoon. I went to see her without telling Thomas. I know how that sounds. I want to be honest about it. It felt like a betrayal. And I sat in her office fighting back tears because the man I loved was also, in some way, part of the problem I was trying to solve. But I also knew that if I told him before I had solid ground under my feet, his brother would know within the hour. That was just the reality I was working with. The attorney helped me understand my situation clearly. She also told me something I hadn't known, that Ruth had actually amended her will 8 months earlier, after her diagnosis. I would find out the full details of the reading, but the attorney confirmed that my position in the estate was different from what his family appeared to assume. I went home. I made dinner. Thomas came in and kissed me on the cheek and said his brother had sent over some documents for him to look at. I said, "I'd rather you didn't sign anything until after we've spoken to the estate attorney together." He looked at me. "She said we don't really need to." "Thomas," I said it the way Ruth used to say things, quietly without raising my voice, "please." He put the documents on the counter, and we ate dinner, and I told him I loved him, and I did mean it. The will reading was held at Helen's office downtown. My brother-in-law arrived looking confident in the specific way that people look confident when they believe the room is already arranged in their favor. My sister-in-law had brought her husband. Thomas sat next to me and held my hand. Helen read the will. Ruth had been extraordinarily deliberate. The house went to Thomas and me jointly. Not to Thomas alone, jointly, because Ruth had specifically added that language in the amendment. Her investment accounts, which none of us had fully known the extent of, totaled just under $340,000. She had been careful and private with her finances her entire life, and she had divided them with specific percentages, with Thomas and me receiving the largest share alongside provisions for her grandchildren's education funds. There was also a handwritten letter, which Ruth had asked to be read aloud. I will not repeat everything it said because some of it is too personal, but I will say that she addressed me by name. She thanked me for the drives to the cancer center. She thanked me for the late nights. She said she had amended the will because she wanted to make sure that the person who had shown up, truly shown up, was protected. She said she had seen more than her children realized. She said she hoped her family would learn from this. My brother-in-law's face during that letter was something I will never forget. Not anger exactly, more like a man watching a plan dissolve in real time and not yet knowing how to recalibrate. His friend, the one who had been in the kitchen at Ruth's house the day of the funeral, had apparently advised him on a strategy that depended entirely on Thomas having broad discretion over the estate. Ruth had apparently anticipated something like this. The joint language in the deed was not an accident. After the reading, in the parking lot, my brother-in-law tried to speak to me privately. He said he thought there had been some miscommunication, and he hoped we could keep things civil for Thomas's sake. I told him I agreed that civility was a good idea, and that I'd be following up with Helen's office about the jewelry that had gone missing from Ruth's dresser. He didn't respond to that. The jewelry situation did get followed up on. My sister-in-law eventually returned most of what she had taken, not because she was asked nicely, but because Helen's office sent a formal letter outlining that removing property from an estate prior to distribution could have legal consequences. The pearl earrings were not among what came back. I have chosen not to push further on that specific item, not because I don't know what it means, but because Ruth would have found the fight undignified, and I am trying every day to make choices she would have respected. Thomas and I had very hard conversations in the weeks after. I showed him the shared notes app. I showed him what I had documented. I did not do this to make him feel terrible. I did it because I needed him to see clearly, in the way that Ruth's letter had asked the family to see clearly what had actually been happening. He cried. He apologized. He called his brother and had the first genuinely honest conversation they had apparently ever had as adults, at least according to Thomas. His brother did not respond well. He accused Thomas of being controlled by me, which is a particular irony I will leave without further comment. They have not spoken much since. Thomas grieves that in a way that's real, and I don't minimize it. Losing the idea of who your brother is, that's its own kind of loss, even when the brother in question was never exactly who you thought. What I want to say to anyone watching this who has been through something like it is, document everything, not because you're paranoid, because you deserve a record of your own life. Because people who count on you staying confused will always be surprised when you don't. Ruth's house is being kept for now. We're still deciding what to do with it long term. Some weekends, Thomas and I go out there and just sit in her kitchen. I make her cornbread sometimes, from memory, from what she taught me. I'm not very good at it yet. I think that's okay. I think she would have laughed at how uneven my edges are and handed me a second cup of coffee and told me to try again. The last thing she ever said to me, it was about a week before she passed, and she was having a clear day, one of the ones where the fog lifted for a few hours. She took my hand and said, "You're going to be all right, Adriana. I need you to know that." At the time, I thought she meant grief. I think now she meant more than that. I think she had already made the decision she needed to make. I think she was telling me she had taken care of it. She had. I keep coming back to one image, Ruth's cornbread. Uneven edges, a little too dark on one side, but she'd hand it to you like it was perfect, and somehow it tasted like it was. I think about that whenever I try to make sense of everything that happened. The funeral, the overheard conversation, the missing jewelry box, the note I was never supposed to see on my own phone. People ask me sometimes if I feel angry. The honest answer is that I did, for a while. A specific, clarifying kind of anger that I think actually kept me moving when I might have otherwise just sat down on the floor and stayed there. But here's what I've come to understand, really understand, about the way things unfolded. The outcomes in this story were not random. They followed from choices. Ruth made deliberate choices to amend her will, to write that letter, to use language in a deed that protected someone she believed deserved protecting. Her brother-in-law made choices too, to exclude, to maneuver, to assume that the person who had shown up for 8 months of chemo appointments and 2 a.m. television wouldn't notice or wouldn't act. Those choices had consequences, not because the universe was keeping score in some cosmic ledger, but because actions leave evidence, and evidence lives in the world. What Ruth modeled for me, and I don't think she knew she was doing it, that's the thing about people like her, was what it looks like to live with your character intact when no one is watching. She didn't tell me she'd amended the will. She didn't say, "I see what you're doing for me and I'm going to reward you." She just made a quiet, clear-eyed decision based on who had actually been present. That's integrity. Not the kind you perform for an audience. The kind that shows up in a document a lawyer reads aloud 8 months after you made it. I had to find my own version of that. When I called the estate attorney at 8 in the morning without telling Thomas that was not a comfortable decision, it felt disloyal. It felt scared. But it was also the right thing to do, and I knew it, and I did it anyway while crying in my car in a parking garage downtown. That's the part they don't tell you about doing the right thing. It doesn't always feel noble in the moment. Sometimes it feels terrible, and you do it anyway because the alternative is worse. And Thomas. I want to say something about Thomas because it would be easy to tell this story and make him a villain, and that wouldn't be true. He was a man who had never learned to see a particular pattern clearly, and when I showed it to him, not as an accusation but as a fact, he looked at it. That takes something real. It takes the willingness to sit with an uncomfortable truth and not run from it and not blame the person who handed it to you. I don't take that for granted. What I want to leave anyone with who has been in a version of this situation, who has loved someone's family harder than that family loved them back, who has stayed when it wasn't easy, who has documented dates on a notes app at midnight just in case, is this: your consistency is not invisible. It gets recorded somewhere, even if not by anyone you expect. Keep being someone you'd recognize in a document read aloud in a lawyer's office. Pay attention. Stay clear-headed when people are counting on you being confused. And don't mistake someone's assumption that you won't act for an actual reason not to. Ruth knew. That's what I keep coming back to. She knew, and she handled it. And then she held my hand and told me I was going to be all right. She was right.